The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM. Application security is hard when security is separated from your DevOps workflow. Security has traditionally been the final hurdle in the development lifecycle. Iterative development workflows can make security a release bottleneck. With GitLab, security is built into the CI/CD process. Every code commit is automatically scanned for security vulnerabilities in your code and its dependencies. Results are delivered to the developer in their native workflow for rapid remediation. Learn how GitLab enables DevSecOps. Visit securityweekly.com/GitLab for a 30-day free trial. With 84% of cyber attacks targeting the application layer, securing your software is more challenging than ever. Synopsys enables DevSecOps with a portfolio of industry-leading tools including Coverity, Black Duck, and Seeker to help you build secure, high-quality software faster. Synopsys is the leader in application security testing. Visit securityweekly.com/Synopsys to learn more.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by Matt Alderman and John Kinsella. Do you always end up missing our live streams? Shame on you. Not really. Do you need somewhere? See, I was trying to improvise, and I just want everyone to listen to our live streams. But if you don't listen to our live streams and need somewhere to flag Security Weekly podcasts, subscribe on your favorite podcast catcher or on our YouTube channel. You can also sign up for our mailing list or join our Discord server to stay in the loop on all things Security Weekly. Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe. In our upcoming webcasts and technical trainings, you will learn how to prevent phishing scams and how to move beyond vulnerability scan to vulnerability fix. Visit securityweekly.com/webcast to see what we have coming up, or visit securityweekly.com/on-demand to view our previously recorded webcasts.
Mike, the reason everybody's not on Discord right now they're all resting because Thursday's a big day with Unlocked. It's going to be a long day, pre-recorded content, live content. We have over 900 people registered. So they're catching their breath this week. That's all.
Catch your breath. Thank you for mentioning that, because I will actually also be talking with a fun panel about API security, and I will be hanging out in the Discord channel. So come live. So come on by. You can ask questions, or if you don't ask any questions, I'm just going to keep dropping GIFs that are movie references to horror movies that I quite enjoy. So your choice. And of course, there's plenty of other great. We've got 3 different tracks going that day. So December 10th, Security Weekly Unlocked, going to be very busy and very informative. Come on by. Speaking of informative, before we dive into some news, I did dig up an editorial that I just want to read from real quick. It only came out 3 days ago on December 4th. And it mentioned that in early November, it involved a so-called computer virus, which nearly paralyzed 6,000 military and academic computers. And it also says, consider the consequences of a similar prank, it puts in air quotes, perpetrated on our air traffic control system, our regional banking system, or a hospital information system. And we're well into this information age, a time when the computer is at least as vital to our national health, safety, and survival as any other single resource. So that came out December 4th, and just checking my notes, that actually came out December 4th, 1988. So let's see what the news looks like in December 7th, 2020, in terms of computer security. And the first
pretty much
one,
the same.
yeah.
We were talking about this on Enterprise Security Weekly, I think, last week. It's like, wait, we've been talking about the same stuff for like 15, 20 years. It really hasn't changed a whole lot.
Hasn't changed a whole lot.
This is sort of what I was trying to get over to, not directly, but what I was asking our guest in the last segment, Mike, how has your job changed over the last few years? What are you guys, not so much what are you doing differently, but and I'm sure any customer, anybody out there, right? We're not doing the exact same thing we were doing years ago, but I think it's interesting to think about how has that changed, how has it improved? Otherwise we get stuck thinking that it hasn't improved at all, and it's at least we're not still patching, I don't know, Amigas or something. But yeah, it's we're not quite done yet, huh?
Well, I mean, he said it in the last one, right? I mean, we were talking about some of the big problems they're still trying to face. Application inventory, right? Just knowing what you have and what's available. I mean, we've been talking about this for at least 20 years. I mean, it's still a problem, right? For CISOs and other organizations. Collaboration, communicating with the DevOps teams, right? I mean, this isn't new. I mean, maybe the team has shifted slightly. It used to be the IT team. Now it's the development team. But I mean, at the end of the day, it's about communication, collaboration, inventory, understanding what you have, and putting protections in place. But we haven't made much of a dent.
Indeed, we do need to make more of a dent. And that's why I pulled out, I think, a variety of articles this week to try to show us a couple different, the past as well as the future of are we making a dent or where are we making a dent. The first one real quick is just an article talking about 8% of all Google Play apps vulnerable to an old bug in basically the Play library. And what was just mostly interesting there, it just falls into that ongoing narrative of patch your, install the patch, update the library. And this is something that the vulnerability has been known since around March, but a bunch of consequential apps with a lot of users still haven't adopted it. So it's definitely that tension between, sure, a company can fix their library, fix that patch, but if you're running APIs, and this is a little bit of a teaser to Thursday, how do you ensure people are actually updating or migrating to the latest version of your library or the latest version of your API rather than sitting out and on the old version, which still works for their application, but works in a way that has a vulnerability in it. So I thought that was just a good on-theme kind of teaser for the rest of this segment.
Yeah, and it ties into the Docker Hub story of the number of images that have at least one critical vulnerability, right? These are all tied together, right? If I have an open source component or a bug in one of these areas that hasn't been patched, now I've got an image sitting in a repository like Docker Hub that has these vulnerabilities in them.
Yeah, and it definitely points to that responsibility of. Oh, go ahead, John.
Yeah, so I erupted some poor coworker last week when they mentioned that Docker spec to me because it seems sort of useless to me. Sorry, but so what I want to ask though, Mike, to your question, excuse me, Matt. Now I'm doing it. Is those Android apps that have vulnerabilities, are they super popular? Are they the top? Did they come out also last week on Android's list of best apps for 2020, or are they something that someone almost downloads by accident or because someone pushes them to click on a link and download it? Yeah. And the same question, the sort of second half of that same question for Docker. Shit, man, come on. We've seen this stat for at least 2 or 3 years. We know that place is a cesspool of crap. What the hell are people doing about it? I mean, don't tell me the damn thing is still full with, a bunch of useless packages which have a ton of vulnerabilities in them. Oh my God, they're going to end up in someone's Kubernetes cluster that has a TCP port exposed to the internet. It's going to get hacked. Hot damn, I think we know that by now. So, sorry, soapbox, but how do we get past that? How do we make better? Okay, so Snyk now has a partnership with Docker and they're scanning everything. They're telling us once again about stuff we already knew. Is Snyk fixing that, or is someone else fixing that, or how can we move beyond saying that there's an elephant in a room? None of us can sit down anymore. We know there's an elephant here. So what do we do about it?
Yeah, and I think one of the things I was emphasizing there is that it's moving a lot of the responsibility on to app owners to understand what you're consuming, and you are responsible for the patching. And I think the point to your question too is that sure, there can be a lot of vulnerable apps on the Play Store that nobody knows about or nobody uses or they only download by accident. In this case, the article was pointing out that some somewhat popular apps still have that, both from everything from the Edge browser that's on the Google Play Store, for those of you who want to use it, to Grindr, OkCupid, Cisco Teams, some things that are recognizable. They do at least have a sizable population. And to the point about this Docker repository, I think they scanned 6,500 images, something like that. And one of my questions is actually just the same as yours, John. How many of those are just kind of one-off that nobody is ever going to download and use? But regardless of that, if we're really just pointing out the fact that, hey, look, here's a repo of images, and it has outdated software. So make sure after you download it, you update the software. And if you're not doing that, I think that is something that you're very much missing, both in automation as well as a responsibility for the DevOps team, rather than just saying, we're going to pretend any image in the world is immutable and we're going to leave it immutable, meaning we're not going to patch it. So that's what at least I would try to point out and help us nudge forward, perhaps, getting out of this mess of just known vulnerabilities in known source, source dependencies. Let's make that more dependable security-wise.
I guess my question is, if you're gonna host a set of container images, what is your responsibility in making sure that they're updated and ready to go? Right? What happened to DTR? Is it part of Mirantis now when they bought Docker Enterprise and there is no more trusted repository from Docker, and Docker Hub just continues to be, to John's words, a cesspool of images? I mean, if you're going to host them, who's responsible for making sure they stay up to date? Otherwise, don't host them.
So we've seen shared responsibility model being very well documented and very well explained in the cloud service providers. So yeah, Matt, I think you're kind of highlighting that if you're running a store of any like that, whether it is, for example, Slack or Atlassian, they have store force.com. All of these have stores for apps that can hook into their SaaS offerings. Maybe that's also, to your point, there's a responsibility for if you're offering such a thing to keep it updated or have some type of vetting on what you're providing to your end users.
And I feel the need, as always, when I start talking about this type of stuff, to remind people that I actually like Docker, and I really like a lot of the people at Docker. So I'm not so much complaining about what Docker is storing or hosting, but just we know about this, right? I think, Matt, to your question, real Matt, or your comment, if you look at, I think Red Hat has a bit more of a curated repo. We'll be interested to see what Amazon does with theirs when it comes out, if that's going to be just public or more curated. But I think really at the end of the day, that's what people want is, back to, Mike, your favorite phrase of secure by default, one of your favorite phrases. Let's have the default images which you can download be secured and known. And then, hey, maybe you want that, that special Pikachu Docker image, and you can do a -- download unsafe or download unverified. So let's think a little more like that, and I think that's a little more useful to people.
Yeah,
I think that's a great
think there's value in doing something more curated, and at least give people the ability to know that it's at least close to updated. Maybe it's not 100%, but it's got to be better than stuff sitting there for years just going stagnant.
It's tough to do though, right? Because I'll let this go after this, Mike. But it's tough to do, right? We thought about it at LI. A lot of folks out there have thought about, hey, can we come up with a catalog of blessed images or signed images or stuff for the people to use? Someone must be doing it as a service, but it's sort of difficult to do, right? That's it's a lot of work for not a lot of love. So hopefully someone can wrap their head around how to do it a little better.
Well, I think you've set up a great segue. So I want to skip over to the GitHub's Octoverse report. And they did a state of the Octoverse. They actually did 3 reports. One was community, something else that I just forgot, and a security report. And it's the security report that I want to highlight right now, because one of the things that stood out is that, as we know, Microsoft bought GitHub. GitHub also has Dependabot and SEML with their code QL. So they're able to scan for dependencies and security problems there, as well as scan for code. And so what we've got now is a report that's some feedback about that. And now one other thing to set this up is, of course, GitHub is hosting the repositories. So this is a little bit, it's a little bit similar to, Docker hosting images. But in this case, obviously GitHub doesn't have quite the responsibility to dive into the repos, but it is providing tools. And what its tools are showing is that automation with something like, very specifically, like Dependabot, it accelerates that open source supply chain security. So if we're talking about what are the dependencies that you have, if you're using Dependabot, they're seeing teams patch identify and patch 1.4 times faster those types of vulnerabilities that are showing up there. And they're also pointing out, just another quick number, in modern software, 80% or more of most applications code comes from dependencies. So quite clearly, that's our attack surface, as a bit of a callback to the segment with Mike and John. And the other thing that stood out to me is, scanning real quick, is that I just forgot where I was going with that. I know. I think it was more of the point that if you're using this is what it was. Often it can take 4 years to find a vulnerability. That was the other really thing that stood out within this report, and 30 days to fix it. So if we pull in time as a dimension, as a metric for us to look at, hopefully we're going to shrink that 4 years based on automation using something like Dependabot or CodeQL or OWASP Web App Scanner, near and dear to my heart, or of course some other type of automation. Let's narrow that time to find the vulnerability, and then 30 days to fix it. I'll wave my hands a little bit and just kind of be agnostic about whether that's a decent number or not. But it's at least better than the callback to the Google Play, where that was a patch available in March, and to this day, many months later, in other words, a lot more than 30 days, a lot of apps still haven't patched that. So I think there's a good theme here that's developing about that GitHub is looking at.
The one graphic in here I like is the language kind of rankings, right? JavaScript's at the top. It's been at the top. It's still at the top. And you want to talk about dependencies and all the issues with dependencies. JavaScript is the baby, right? I mean, it is the poster child for this. Python, Java, similar. But I look at Ruby, right? We've talked about Ruby a little bit. We've talked about some of the other languages over the past few weeks. I mean, way down on the list now. So it's interesting when you look at some of these languages and where the issues are coming from. It should give some insight to the developers to be like, do I really want to code in that language or not? Kind of discussion.
Yeah, I'd love to. We definitely have to do a deep dive sometime on one of our topic segments about the choice of language, because we've talked a couple other times about, I think it was just last week, talking about Amazon shifting to Rust, and just trying to say maybe we want to worry less about memory safety issues and just adopt a language that's going to make it a lot harder for us to introduce those problems. And server-side JavaScript is probably contributing to some problems in our own code, as well as this point, I think that their number is close to 700 dependencies on average. Just pulling in 700 dependencies and trying to keep them updated, you're making things perhaps more complex than you really need to be.
Juggling with knives.
Juggling with knives. We should be juggling with chainsaws safely because we've practiced. I'm going to shift to, well, let's see. We've been talking about finding vulns and vulns in our dependencies. Let's jump really quick to the Web Security Testing Guide from OWASP, and a companion to it, although not from OWASP, this idea of cross-site leaks. One of the things I just wanted to point out, one, as an educational resource, we don't highlight them quite enough as we should, so I wanted to make sure we get the WSTG in here for everyone. Great resource for just understanding how do I go about doing some manual testing. I worry about an application. What should I go through? I would highlight one, the OWASP ASVS, Application Security Verification Standard, is also honestly quite a great framework as well for understanding how should I be testing. But if our theme is going off on some soapboxes for this episode, my soapbox here is that the security testing guide still calls, I think, too much attention to the idea of input validation, and especially cross-site scripting. And I think cross-site scripting, I'm going to venture, is not at all an input validation issue. And when we get into some themes of why we're still dealing with problems from 1988 into 2020, I think a little bit the security community hasn't paid attention enough into precision and improving how we talk about vulnerabilities. Because really, XSS, for example, should just be where are you writing out or displaying user-supplied input, and are you encoding it properly? And a lot of that can actually also be said, too, for parameterized queries, RCEs even, and command injection. A lot of those are not really just input validation issues, but more of how are you managing the data that you've received. So that's a little bit of the nitpick I want there, but otherwise actually a great resource.
Yeah, and I've been talking to the OWASP folks. There's some updates coming early next year. I'm trying to get them on the show to kind of update the audience on some of the stuff that they're doing. There are lots of great resources out there from OWASP, as you mentioned, Mike. We haven't brought them on. I am trying to get some of those folks on next year, because when I look at the testing guide, I'm scrolling through looking for the changes, and one of the areas we talked a little bit about, I think last segment, just briefly, was API security testing and stuff. And there's just one little section on how to test GraphQL. There's probably more around API security testing that's not in here yet, as we continue to think about new attack vectors in our applications. And so I'd like to see some more evolution on aspects of this.
Yeah, and absolutely some more on business logic, and as well as the authorization tokens. And that idea is your OAuth token an authentication token or authorization token? That's a little bit of a theme that actually I think we've heard a couple times from guests so far. And also, too, this is my pitch for come listen to us on Thursday at the API panel. But John, you were also saying something.
Yeah, those are some good points, especially the business logic one. But what I was going to say is, and I think business logic, is that a web application, or is that sort of what happens behind the scenes? That might be why they don't look at it too closely here. It's just a guess. But I think what I want to talk about for a second, what's interesting around this, all three of us, we've used OWASP for 10, 15 years probably. So we don't talk about OWASP a lot on here because for us it's sort of old hat. We're familiar with it. We reference it occasionally, especially top 10 and that type of thing. But there's so much great stuff on this site. And what I want to call back to some of our listeners is, if you're a Qualys customer or Rapid7, I can say that now since I don't work there anymore, or any of these vendors, and you click a button to get the scan done, please come study this. Or if you're thinking about buying a commercial or an open source product, right? And really what I'm trying to get to is, as you go through this document and think about how do you actually test something, when you click that button or when you get the results back, you have a better understanding of what Mike wrote at his previous job, or, what is it doing? Is it testing everything? Is there a part that it's missing? When you go to explain that report to your boss or someone else, you're able to actually have an understanding of what this thing's talking about. So there's a ton of value in understanding what OWASP is doing. It's not the prettiest site, right? It's for engineers by engineers. But there's so much really great stuff in here that it's, go spend an afternoon with a tasty beverage and soak up some knowledge if you don't know this very well.
Indeed. And that's going to give me a chance. You're going to need a little bit more than an afternoon and perhaps more than one tasty beverage to get through the epic write-up about an iOS zero-click. And this is 30,000 words, which basically boils down to some dude at Project Zero figured out how to reboot an iPhone, which I say a little bit facetiously because he actually did that about rebooting many iPhones at once using the radio interface, meaning you just need to be, in somewhat of proximity, but you don't need any interaction. And it's a great read, great resource. It's going to be a little bit hard to summarize concisely, but I'm going to try in the sense that to break it down into a couple themes. One is, what's the mental process for looking at, thinking of a threat model? So, and this was a 6-month journey that the researcher went through. And he started out with, hey, there is this AWDL. What is it in the sense of how do iPhones talk to each other over the radio? Especially they build their own peer-to-peer mesh networks. So that was sort of the initial seed. And then it goes into some great background on what is AWDL. What are some tools that I can use with libpcap, with Scapy, with Raspberry Pi devices? How can I build up some ways to interact with radio? So also great hands-on engineering, electrical engineering, a little bit behind there too. And then it goes into finding a particular vuln in this protocol that the way that the devices are talking with each other, and then being able to figure out what is my implant, or what is the exploit that I can generate, and poking a little bit into the internals of the iPhone, both in calling out pointer authentication codes, which are a great new resource, or new security resource available on recent ARM chips, as well as tools like dtrace. So it has a great end-to-end journey, and again, 30,000-word epic journey of, here's an idea about something that looks interesting. Lots of devices talk to each other automatically without user interaction over the radio, and then getting into the radio waves itself, and then onto the device itself, and then ultimately showing a really neat demo, which you can find linked to in the write-up, of just 15 seconds or so that shows pressing the button on your attacking iPhone, and then a dozen or so others nearby just start to reboot. And so that was hopefully a lot less than 30,000 words, but gives you a teaser to go out and read this.
Yeah, I haven't
that
read it
wasn't
yet.
enough of a teaser for me. That's way too long still.
Really? I want those. I want to get a few of those tasty beverages and go over this, because I think it's a fun read, and it's I keep a Faraday bag around for when I bring my phone somewhere where I'm I don't use it very often, let's be honest, but I do use it. And this is sort of one of those cases where, oh, hey, it's actually useful to actually keep that thing around. But yeah, it's, at least from what I've heard about this so far, and Mike, as you were saying, unencrypted mesh network, and actually, folks, Amazon Sidewalk, we haven't got this in here, but if the researchers want to do a little research, they're about to turn out an Amazon Sidewalk on all or on most Ring devices, so they're actually building a mesh network around your house. I'm not sure if that's encrypted, but maybe not. So, this isn't the first or last we're going to see this type of thing, but I think this is probably, come on, Matt, this is a good read.
It can also be a fun read to take us on different areas of threat modeling and what are the tools we have available to us. So from fuzzers to talking about, can pointer authentication codes and control flow integrity help us here? How should it work? ASLR. These are some acronyms that I'm just throwing out very quickly that we've talked about in the past. And this is a great example of talking through how well are they protecting us? Did we did we assume that they would be protecting us from threat models that actually they weren't designed for, and so on? So great departure points for discussions with your engineers. And you can also have discussions with your DevOps engineers on, I think, some articles that might be a little bit more closer to home or more appealing to you, Matt, on two that I think are a good pair: Antipatterns that can hurt DevOps, as well as 5 myths of DevOps in the enterprise. So I'm curious what in there perhaps stood out to you.
Well, as I go through on the weekends and I start pulling my articles for the week, I run across a couple different interesting articles. And this one on the 5 myths of DevOps I thought was intriguing. I wanted to dig into it a little more. And as you get into it, you're like, that sounds pretty right. So as you lay this out, right, there is a single right way to do DevOps. Yeah, not. Right? We've seen that, right? We even talked about that last segment. This is going to vary customer to customer. But number 2 was a really big one. Buying DevOps tools means I'm doing DevOps. And it was just great because you see so many DevSecOps articles from security tool vendors trying to push this concept of, hey, you just buy my tool, you're doing DevSecOps. Same thing kind of exists in the DevOps world. So anyways, I read this article and just got a kick out of it, so I had to throw it in here.
No, I love that. And actually, speaking of, you're quite right on the. I'll go on a little bit of rant. The tool vendors do love to put out their white papers about here's how our tool, by the way, highlights some aspects of DevOps or some automation or some gives us some insight. But they're always behind a marketing sign-up page, which GitHub put their Octoverse insights behind. None of that. You could just click and read. So kudos, thank you to GitHub for doing that. And please, other tool vendors, we will read and perhaps highlight your white papers here, but don't put them behind those marketing walls. They're tough to get through, and they're not really that helpful. If we want a tool to tie into the collaboration of our DevOps team, we'll reach out. But just having that tool, to repeat what Matt said, doesn't make us DevOps.
Yeah, and to that point, there were 2 articles for BSW this afternoon that had paywalls to their guides, and I deleted those articles out of my news coverage because that's not how we're going to cover the news.
Nice.
Click, click, delete. That will be one of the things we will. So talking about the Antipatterns, we are going to instill a blame culture on paywalls and marketing walls for white papers. But otherwise, we are going to try to avoid some Antipatterns and break them based on this article. And what I liked about this article, it was calling attention to a couple Antipatterns. And of course, it was providing what should we do about it. So it's really easy just to point fingers and say, don't do that. That's the wrong thing to do. That's the wrong thing to do. Also, don't do that other thing. But if you're not really providing some ideas about what's the path forward, then it's sort of a shrug. Let's move on. And in this case, there were a wrong perception of the DevOps team, a poor choice of technology, which I think highlights very much the tool does not make the DevOps team, but the way you can API, interact with it, bring it into your automation does help you. And unclear responsibilities. That's another one that stands out to me in the sense of we were talking about already. Where does the responsibility lie in that shared responsibility model if we're talking about cloud service providers or, for example, Docker, or between dev and ops? And that was even, I think was it last week when we were talking with Tim Mackey about, sure, the dev team has some tools. They are getting some security information. They're pushing that information forward to the ops team, and the ops team should have some information about what's our responsibility for keeping this secure now that we have to run it. What vulnerabilities did you find, and do they meet our risk appetite? So I think this is a great article that ties into what a lot of our guests have been saying about ways of building really productive and really effective DevOps teams.
Yeah, my only concern with this article when I read it is, are they saying that by going with NoSQL, you solve all these issues from a database DevOps perspective? It just wraps really, really weird for me. It's like, okay, point taken, point taken, point taken. But your solution is a NoSQL database? Really?
That was a NoSQL non sequitur. Yeah, I was like, speaking of like tool vendors, I was sort of like, did you, on a bet, did you have to use the word like pineapple and NoSQL in your article and you only got, 50% of the way there? Yeah, I shook my head and kind of skipped that.
Yeah, that was the thing. It's like you lay out all this stuff, right? And you're like, yes, yes, yes. And then your solution is NoSQL.
What? Yeah.
Yeah, it makes no sense.
Well, my solution to the ASW podcast is definitely not going to be no co-host, because I appreciate having Matt and John joining me every week. So thank you once again, guys. Also enjoy having all of you join us for the live stream, or of course, if you're listening to us afterwards on your favorite podcast catcher, please do so. And whether you are listening live or after the fact, come join in our Discord server because we'd love to chat with you. And of course, one more pitch for our Security Weekly Unlocked this Thursday, December 10th. Come join us, listen to API Security Panel, as well as many other panels and presentations. And with that, hopefully we didn't lose anyone on this expedition. So thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week and this Thursday on Application Security Weekly.